Hi, welcome back, everyone. So now we have a very special presentation by Nicolas, Didier, and Mauricio, who goes more by Pacha. And they're going to look at public expenditures and gaining sort of efficiencies across that, and open data within government, obviously a large aspect of interest. So thank you very much.
Welcome. Okay, so now we start. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, can you please tell me that you can see my screen?
That's good.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, Nicolas, when you're ready.
Okay, you have like a window of chat over the presentation.
Oh, so sorry.
Okay. Well, let's start. Well, welcome everybody. This is our presentation. This will be different than the other presentations because we were looking for a very practical problem on science reproducibility. We have a lot of concerns about the situation of our country in that matters. So we bring up some evidence about what is the situation of think tanks in this matter. Please, Mauricio. Okay. So from a rational point of view, well, my area of expertise is public administration. So I am so concerned about how government make decisions. And the problem is that it's highly desirable, like as a common topic, that the policymakers have good information for me to get the best decision or the best outcome. And we know, like from the theory, that people and often the policymakers have this about the rationale, so they can assume and understand not all the information available, and they take their own understanding in the policymaking process. We are in a strange time that we have a lot of source of information. We have the government information, academia is producing highly vast amount of knowledge right now. And in the other side, we have the civil society, group of interest, and even consulting companies that are promoting their own agendas. And that is the case, for example, the future of work topic, that you have companies as Cisco or consultancy service as Tata promoting their own understanding. And that is information that is surrounding some topics. We also have information about how other governments are performing in diverse areas of policy. So we can compare actually how my government is doing compared to another. And that is very interesting in this COVID setting when we are looking for rankings, how the vaccination is going, how much is your death toll. There are all comparisons. There are a lot of information, and we have access to that. But also we have this pressure previous to the COVID to the idea of, well, if we have more information about the government should be more accountable. And you have a huge literature about open governments and government, with the idea of, okay, more empowered citizens will ask the government to behave in some way because they have the access to the information of the government and other compared policies. Next. We have a great debate with Mauricio. Like we have been discussing this issue like 6 months, because we agree that it's important, the science reproducibility. But why it's so important? And we have two kinds of arguments, like normative argument, like the scientists should pursue reproducibility in order to achieve some transparency in the research. And that is a value. But we have the other side, a pragmatic argument. That is, if the information is not true, it's not correct, then it will affect the value of information. As an economic phenomena, if the value of information is decreasing, we have a we have large problems of coordination agents. These agents, in our case, the government, public sector, private sector, and the civil society. Now, we also have another problem, that is, we have incentives on our practitioner side. The problem, they have to achieve the best outcome with the low resource, like the classical optimization problem. They have to optimize the resource, time, data. And the fact is that our practitioners, they are having more influence of science or scientific communication on their decision. But how that is translated to practice is the real issue. Because one thing is that I read a paper, and the second thing is how I translate into the domain to the reality of my country or institution or possibilities. So this is the main discussion that we have with Mauricio, because it's a gold standard, it could be. Science reproducibility is not only about values of science. It's about how we set comparison between the information that we have access in this complex society. And we have two traditions or approach. One is the econometric tradition. When we are looking for research design, and we are judging the estimates of a model due to the constraint of the research design. So, for example, we are looking for experiments. Experiments appears as the gold standard for causal inference. Not always we have the resources, a lot of money is required in the policy settings to have this kind of information. And in the other side, we have the data science approach, where you are focused on the data workflow. And basically, how you make you take the proper steps to ensure the quality of the data analysis that you will be performing.
Okay, my turn. So this diagram that we can see here is all about computational reproducibility. But there are questions before even this diagram starts. For example, if we go into the data, if we are using a survey, we have questions. For example, what happens regarding the data validity? For example, if we care about science reproducibility, we need to start thinking before this diagram starts. What we have here is good. Actually, it's really desirable to have a replication standard because of transparency. But if we're working with surveys, do we really understand the sampling method? Do we really understand if the data was created under good standards and transparency? So we aim for a gold standard, which is actually good. So we ask, is science equivalent to a publication? So science involves research questions, of course, and also decision-making. Are we using this data because this is the best available data? And how do we face the limitations of that data inputs? Where do the problems met? Here is a quote, Thomas Lumley. I was able to interview him a few months ago. And he basically tells us, wisely, that when something is reproducible, it doesn't necessarily mean that the methodology and other important aspects in a study are correct. And he's right. It's good to be transparent, but you also need to give a look into methodology. So this diagram is probably known for most of us here. And if I get into the mind of an analyst working for a think tank, probably I have to think about this. So I'm basically using secondary sources. So I have to import data, for example, created by the government. And from this very initial step and ongoing, we have different questions that leads us to problems. This diagram, of course, is adapted from R4DS, a fantastic book. So the first problem, if I'm an analyst working for a think tank, is the data quality assurance. I have to think about that, and we will review that on a later stage of this presentation. We have a second problem. What happens if my study is not reproducible? For example, if the analyst working for the think tank is not reporting how did the data curation, for example, you need to be very careful about reporting this. How and why did you clean the data? How did you transform the variables? Okay, and that it's going to create a direct impact in the model in the case I'm doing some statistical modeling. And the third problem is misleading and the bad use of concepts, and that is closely related to communication. That's something that escapes from the analysis itself sometimes, and it's related to how good are we at communicating our research results.
Well, that is the part that is like a little unsettling, because okay, we will want to have information to make the best comparison, the best assessment on a policy problem. The thing is that the quality of information in public spheres often depend on the institutional setting of the countries. So for example, the OECD, the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, they look for information across the world, and they provide nice visualizations about some standards. Like that is how the world is behaving. The problem that is never acknowledged how robust or not is the statistical institution in our countries. And that is particularly a topic of interest if you want to analyze the diffusion of a policy, or if you want to translate a policy between two countries. For example, if you have a bad sampling in your employment surveys, you will be comparing two labor markets like, okay, they should behave in that way. But if you are omitting a large population, for example, informal jobs, the labor market representation that you will be providing will be biased. So the comparison will be biased, and the estimate and the rationale between the comparison and the translation to the policy will be biased. We have a recent case in our country where in a law reform about the penalties about restriction to civil rights in order to get more security, researchers went to the Congress, said there is a bad idea. There is no evidence with international evidence and national evidence. They refuted every argument of the commission in the Senate. Well, the laws were approved, and then the problems still were there. So that is a huge problem. It's not about only the comprehension or having the information. It's about the possibility of understanding what this information entails.
Okay, so what Nicolas is describing, it's obviously a concern, but let me give you a good example from Chile. During the 20th century, Chile was actually a poor country, but we had a really good example of alternative cost evaluation. There was a medical doctor, Fernando Monkeberg. He is a Chilean fellow, he's still alive, and he conducted a long study during more than 50 years, actually, with a first initial stage that covered 20 years, where he was able to identify undernutrition as the principal cause of hampered socioeconomic development. He was able to detect an impact, a direct impact in human capital as a cause of permanent damage and early mortality. Uh, During this period, the early 50s, the children mortality was really high in our country. And he released a book, Checkmate to Underdevelopment, Jaque al Subdesarrollo, with reviewed and updated editions later. So this direct policy impact was crucial to implement interventions to prevent damage to children before and after birth. Because of that, children was a pioneer in defeating children's undernutrition. That was a huge success for an underdeveloped economy in South America. And also, following this line, Dr. Fernando Monkeberg faced serious political changes, uh, and he persisted with his policy guidelines until today. Uh, just as an example, until the 70s, we had social democracy, then Christian democracy in our country, then socialism, then dictatorship, and then in the 90s, we came back to democracy and centrism. And during all these steep changes to the political compass in our country, he was able to do personal uh, pressure, and he had a lot of insistence and determination to convince the authorities of how to conduct, how to address policy. He is Fernando Monkeberg, a local hero, 94 years old and still lecturing here in Chile. Okay, so now we go back to Nicolas.
Okay. So the main question here is because science reproducibility appears like a huge concept, a huge idea. But when we try to analyze in particular settings, it has to answer to the environmental pressures. For example, uh, we have the idea of the institutional robustness of the statistical system. And we have plenty of cases where we have, in terms of the Inter-American Bank and the World Bank, and a strong and robust system. Still, when you fail in one administration, you break up the comparison between your previous measure. And that happened with our household survey, when a particular government changed the methodology to measure not only poverty, but income. To make this estimate, to increase the estimate about how much the people earn, to say, oh, we are diminishing the poverty. That also happened with or survey of social protection, when they changed the institution that made the study. We have a long panel, but they changed the provider. The consequence, we lost the comparability between years. And those elements becomes those elements are relevant, because when you weaken your national robustness in your statistical system, you are putting a shadow of a doubt in every conclusion that you can draw from that data. Please, Mauricio, advance. Well, we have a had a huge problem with the census in 2012, and that was by a change of the administration that said, okay, the census will be performed by private agencies, not a public agency. That political change cut a long-standing tradition of good census in the region, and that was not only an economic disaster, but also made a huge noise in our statistical system. The projections of population change, the median income change, the poverty line was re-estimated, but with faulty data. And that's the problem.
Yes, thank you. And actually, in addition to that, this census performed in Chile back in 2012 costed $45 million and was a total waste. At some districts, the omission was higher than 20%. So for a census, that's really unacceptable. The national omission was larger than 3 times the Latin American average in other census. So this was, as a conclusion, this was insufficient to count and characterize the population. And at the same time, it had to be repeated. So that was not just a waste of monetary resources, a lot of wasted time and damage to policy.
Well, and that's the whole introduction, but the key point, and I will be succinct. Why to analyze the think tanks? Well, there are varied reasons for that. First, well, in my country, Chile, they perform economic roles that are relevant. They are provided from the state, from studies. They provide the studies, but also they operate as performing lobby from some political agendas. And that will be a weird thing, but the problem is that the relation between the think tanks and the government is not clear. They have sources of funding that are not clearly transparent. And that is a huge issue when we are trying to see this relationship between studies, information, civil society, data, and policymaking. And no, I have to return to the previous because there are two main arguments that are necessary to see. And the second, and why analyze great papers or white papers of think tanks? Well, it's well known that you have a dynamic for PhD holders that cannot remain in the academia by the restriction of the labor market, the size of the institution, and they are into the high. You can Google it. Like, what can I do with my PhD if I want to leave the academia? And they say, no, you can go to the government, you can go to the civil society organizations, foundations. But what you are doing actually is transferring technical capacity to civil society. What is good, but we have a second problem derived from that. That is, what are the space to make science? If you participate from a think tank or a foundation that have a political agenda, you can really do science, or you will be implementing the techniques of science. And that will derive us to the face validity of the opinion, because when you have more connected societies, academia can provide inputs to policymaking. But settings, when you have a closer relation between political parties and think tanks, like in the design of and promoting these political agendas, when you have is like, okay, hey, the researchers all they have PhD. That report should be very serious, robust. It will have a lot of positive characteristics. And that is the problem when we face the challenge of the face validity. A think tank which has an agenda could appear as a valid agent to talk about policy without the concerns about their agenda for the public opinion.
Good. Okay, so because of the time, I'm going to speed up a bit here. Here we can see the Senate total expenditure in consultancy. Basically, they spend more than $300 million per year, and they have a funding that is not accountable. So basically, they can hire different think tanks to provide evidence to support legal changes. And here is the model we were developing. So Nicolas, please.
Well, we are in the first step because this is a long conversation again, but we are in the first step. Like previous presentation, the thing, what we are aiming to do is looking for a real standard to judge the information, because when the policymaker doesn't have the right notion about the nature of the gray paper or a white paper, they can assume that is scientific knowledge. So we are in the first step. We are advancing through this model that is trying to convert to a common notion between what means information and scientific knowledge in society. Next. But what we did, well, we downloaded a bulk of studies between 2010 and 2020. We reviewed it. Then we coded it. And we asked these little 7 questions that we thought that were relevant to any study, even outside of academia, to be able to answer. The first question was, is it an empirical piece? Because not all the production of think tanks are empirical work. They have opinion piece. They have legal reports, like comparative legal studies. So the first question was that. The second is, does it have an explicit methodology? Very important. When you are reading something without a clear understanding of the methodology, you are not so sure about what is the quality of the data. The third part was, okay, what was the methodological approach? Some policies require qualitative research because they are so focused in community dynamics. So it's not all about estimated statistics. It's about how you understand and describe a problem. Mm-hmm. The fourth question was, well, if they use that data, actually, is identified? Because one thing is say, okay, I use administrative data. Okay, from where? Who provided it? What is the quality? Because you have to be able to trace back the information. Do we have access to the data? Because one thing is to perform an analysis, and another completely different thing is trying to replicate without have access to that data. The sixth question was, what kind of analysis was performed? Like in the most simple terms. And finally, if the research procedures were described.
Okay, so as a preliminary result, here we have the chair of reviewed articles by point of view. A large chair is actually empirical work, okay? But the problem with this empirical work can be seen in the next 2 plots. For example, if we go into the methodology, more than 65% of these reviewed articles are not explicit regarding the methodology. A short share are actually explicit or partially explain the methodology. And most of the articles are descriptive. They don't do much simulation or predictive models. And most of these articles are not applicable for data analysis because are basically opinions. So finally, here are the lessons learned. So Nicolas, please.
Well, the first thing is that in policy inquiry, you have to match 2 criteria. You have to have the best information possible, and you have to provide this information in some kind of way that people understand that. And that will be the role of policy informatics, for example, in my field. But the thing is that most of think tanks relies on public information without analyzing the quality of the public information in this matter. And that is problematic, because if you take this full reproducibility approach to the data and the analysis, you will find that if you don't consider this previous element of the data, data will be biased, the results will be biased. That is a simple notion of that. There is no common standard for think tanks. And what is more problematic in this side of the equation is, okay, we don't have like clear standard for communication. We have a lot of descriptive studies, but they are providing prescriptions about policy. And how you link in your mind description with prediction, like with prescription, without inferential statistics? That appears to be a huge issue, especially by the amount of influence that have the think tanks in our country. And the third element is the lack of accountability on the process. There is nothing well described. So even though you can say, okay, you don't have to be so harsh with these civil society organizations, the problem is that when you are in the public arena, you have to compete to provide the best information possible. Without some criterions like this, people like laymen or the policymakers won't have the tools to differentiate what is good information or not. The next. Well, what will be our next efforts with Mauricio? Basically, try to parameterize. But here is not in the mathematical terms, like trying to get some benchmark. What is a good practice here? Because this field of civil society trying to produce science that will be increased by PhD in other sites that others than academia, we will need to meet some standards that could be shared and reproduced across the sector. The second is a standard for whom. Where do you practice science? Is a necessary condition to do science, actually. Like this idea is quite simple, because if I am in a foundation and I have to make I made a research, well, I am still doing science because I use the scientific method and the other controls. We have to ask if the standards are for whom. Reproducibility of what? What should be reproducible? Because if we rely in secondary data, well, there is a lot of things that we cannot control. A lot of things. And we have to begin to think about the sophistication of the data and the requirements of the modern techniques. Today, we have this kind of problem of face value, and I can add words like machine learning and blockchain to any problem, and it will sound fancy and interesting, but not quite true. And that will be a problem. And by my side of the equation, I am concerned about, okay, we have a lot of public information available to perform research. How we can translate this information into policy recommendation, trying to reduce the amount of uncertainty, because again, policy inquiry or this policymaker sphere has a lot of information surrounding it, but requires some mechanism to translate that evidence into practice that can ensure a better outcome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick and Nicolas. It's an increasingly, I don't know, like it's a really important issue, right? What's happening in these consulting firms and these think tanks, and I think it's good that you're shining a bit of a light on it and looking at it. I'm very interested to see where you go with the paper. There's a few questions in the chat, but maybe you can address those in the Slack, Patrick.
Okay.
They're actually the questions I think of our next speaker, so I won't stand in the way. We should try and get back on track. Amy, did you want to introduce Jake? Or?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. Our next speaker is Jake Bowers. He's a senior scientist at the Policy Lab and a member of the lab's data science practice. He's also an associate professor of political science and statistics at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He has served as a fellow in the Office of Evaluation Sciences in the General Services Administration of the U.S. federal government and is methods director for the Evidence in Governance and Politics Network.